Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Math Puzzle Crash Course. We've got a simple word problem here today that has to do with travel. This one, we have John, who took a trip to see a friend who lives 425 miles away. He drove an average of 30 miles per hour in town and 70 miles per hour on the interstate. The trip took 6.5 hours total. How far did John drive on the interstate? How far did he drive in total? Well, obviously, in total, it was 425 miles, but how far did he drive on the interstate? Well, to look at this, one way to look at it, we could create a table here. If you remember, distance is just the rate of travel times the time traveled. So distance equals rate times time. And if we look through the word problem, we know that in town he drove an average of 30 miles an hour, and on the interstate he drove an average of 70 miles per hour. So in this table where we could have distance, rate, and time, we could write in town and interstate. The rate in town, again, is 30 miles per hour. The rate on the interstate is 70 miles per hour, so we could fill that in there. Um, and again, we know the total distance that he would have driven. We know it's 425 miles, and we know that that total distance, it's a combination of the distance traveled in town plus the distance traveled on the interstate. So knowing that, we know it's 425 miles. Um, we could create a variable d, which would be the distance traveled on the interstate. So the distance traveled on the interstate is equal to, well, no, the total distance is equal to the in-town distance, and that would just be 425 minus d, because if we're saying the interstate distance is d, then the in-town distance would be what's left over, which would be the total distance minus the interstate distance, or 425 minus d. So that's and so figuring that out, again, here I've got it a little bit more detailed. We could set this variable d to be the interstate distance. 425 minus d would be our in-town distance. So then we could fill that into our table here. The in-town distance is 425 miles minus d. The interstate distance is d. So we're getting a little bit further along here. We know again, we know that the total time was 6.5 hours. We could create another variable and call it t, where t is the time driven on the interstate. If t is the time driven on the interstate, the time driven in town would be what's left over, which would be the 6.5 hours minus t. So for time, we could fill in 6.5 minus t for in-town driving time, and we could fill in t for the interstate time. So you can see our table's beginning to take shape here, which is what we want to do. So we want to break this problem down, get the important information, and make note of it. So if we're looking at distance, we know that in town, the distance driven was 425 minus d. Well, distance, again, we said before, is equal to rate times time. So our distance in town is 425 minus d, and that's equal to the rate, which is 30 miles per hour, or we have 30 here. The time is 6.5 minus t. Now, see, we've got to put parentheses around that because the rate is multiplied by this time, this entire value, which is 6.5 minus t. Now, in the interstate, it's a little bit easier. The distance there is d, and that's equal to the rate, which is 70 miles per hour. We have that here. The time is t, so d equals 70t. So now we have the two equations we need to work with. Now it's time to start thinking about substituting. So what I decided to do here was solve for time, the t value. In order to do that, well, I need to substitute for d. So I know that d equals 70t. So I can substitute that into my in-town equation. I haven't done that yet here, but you see I have 425 minus d. Well, I know D is equal to 70t. So I can replace this D with 70t. We can go ahead and do that. Here's 425 minus D, or 425 minus 70t. We've done the substitution. So 425 minus 70t equals 30 times the quantity of 6.5 minus t. If we simplify that down a little bit further, we have 425. We can add 70t on both sides of the equation. That brings 70t over here. It goes away on the left. You'll have 70t plus 195 minus 30t. And then you can simplify that down further. What's 70t minus 30t? Well, that's 40t. So that's 40t plus 195. All right, so 425 would be equal to 40t plus 195. Now we can simplify further. We can subtract 195 from both sides of the equation. That'll give us 230 equals 40t. Well, we divide both sides by 40. We can isolate t. T equals 5.75. So that tells us it took 5.75 hours, or 5 3/4 hours, to drive on the interstate. Well, we know it took 6.5 hours for the total trip. So whatever left out of that would be the time driven in town. So, we're well on our way to solving this. So we already know the interstate distance traveled is 70 times the time. And we just figured out that that was 5 3/4 hours driven on the interstate. So if you take 70 miles per hour times 5.75 hours, you'll end up with 402.5 miles. And again, the in-town distance is just the total distance driven minus the interstate distance. That gives us 22.5 miles. So John only drove in town for 22.5 miles. And again, we said the total distance was 425, and that works out right because 402.5 plus 22.5 is 425. And then it's really easy to, oh, I got a mistake here. I can see. We'll try to fix that. Try to make a pen here. That should have been a minus sign. Sorry, that's not an equal sign here. It should be a minus. But the time in town is equal again to the total time minus the time on the interstate. So it's 6.5 minus 5.75 equals 0.75 hours. So the time driven in town. So if we needed to know that, I mean the question originally, I mean we want to get back to what was the only thing we were really asked to do here. Well, what we were really asked to do originally was only the how far did John drive on the interstate? Well, we answered that. We did answer that. On the interstate, he drove 402.5 miles. But when I work these things out, I like to go ahead and figure out, okay, what was the in-town distance? What was the in-town time? And does it make sense? And you kind of look at it roughly in your head and you go, well, we know in town he drove an average of 30 miles an hour. Well, 30 miles in 1 hour, he would have driven 30 miles. Well, in 3/4 of an hour, he's going to drive something under 30 miles, and we got 22.5. So just without even doing any math, it kind of makes sense. It's like, yeah, that sort of makes sense. And then when you look at the interstate time, um, the 425 miles, we know he's driving 70 miles an hour. Well, if he drove, 6 hours that way, that's 420. And another point 0.5 is what? 30, 35, 450. 455 miles, is that right? I'm doing it in my head, okay? Not really that good, but if he drove 70 miles an hour straight, didn't drive in town at all, he would have driven pretty far. Well, we know he didn't drive that far. But so the 402.5 makes sense as well. So hopefully this video has been helpful. And hopefully I don't have any other mistakes in here. Instead of I put the equal sign instead of a minus sign, but I think I got the rest of the. Hopefully my spelling's correct. I know I get called out every so often for not using the proper multiplication symbol, so I do apologize for that. I was kind of lazy in some of these videos and used the X. There's actually is a symbol for the multiplication, so I'm trying to make sure I'm using the proper one. So anyhow, hopefully this video has been helpful to everybody. Please consider like, share, subscribe, and I look forward to seeing everybody in the next video.